Hi, my name is Mina, and if you're new to my channel, welcome. I also run a podcast. I also host a podcast. Run a podcast? Is that even a phrase? I host a podcast called Highbrow, which comes out every Wednesday. And so if you like the sound of my voice, if you like the things that I say, go check it out. If not, I guess that's okay. Let's get into the video. So today we're going to be talking about fashion magazines. If you're like me and you grew up in the 90s and early 2000s and you remember watching The Devil Wears Prada and 13 Going on 30 and the later episodes of Sex and the City when Carrie Bradshaw starts working for Vogue, you also probably had a dream career of one day being a fashion journalist or a fashion editor or even a fashion assistant, though I will get to that conversation later. Another really popular fashion journalism movie I have to give a shout out to is Down with Love. It's not as popular as the other ones that I just mentioned, but it is really funny and really cute. It's a rom-com. It stars Renee Zellweger and Ewan McGregor, and it came out like in 2003. And I guess, I don't know why, it just like didn't take off, but it has amazing costumes. And it's a little kitschy, like it's not very serious, which is the point. And there's like a fantastic musical number at the end.
Look how the neon starts to flicker.
Love's like a shot but works much quicker.
It's a good time with good costuming, and if you don't like either of those things, then I don't know what to tell you, but you should watch it. Anyways, there was just something so glamorous and so aspirational about working at a fashion magazine. I also thought it was a very lucrative career choice because literally everyone who was working at fashion magazines in these movies was living the high life. They had a wardrobe of couture. They lived in beautiful Manhattan apartments. They had everything. And whether or not working at a magazine was ever as glamorous as 13 Going on 30 propagandizes it to be, that's up to the discretion of people who actually worked there in the 90s and 2000s. But one thing's for sure is that in this day and age, working at a magazine does not seem very glamorous. And you know, I don't know too many young people. I don't have friends with kids. Most of my friends don't have kids. Let me amend that statement. I do have a couple friends with kids. Most of my friends don't have kids, so I don't know what kids want to be right now. But I'm wondering, do children still want to be fashion editors? Like, I feel like this was such a late millennial, older Gen Z type of career path aspiration. And yeah, I just don't know. If you're a young person, let me know if this is something you still want to do. To give a sense of what the industry is like today, though, in 2022, Catherine Hopkins analyzed for Women's Wear Daily the trajectory of 50 major magazines. According to the article, print editions of fashion magazines Allure, Cosmopolitan, Elle, InStyle, Marie Claire, and W Magazine have all been cut back since the pandemic. From 2002 to 2020, estimated revenue for periodical publishing, which includes magazines, fell by 40.5%, and 25% of that decrease occurred over the 2010s. Even pre-pandemic, teen style magazines, Teen Vogue and 17, went fully digital. And as of now, there are no major monthly fashion publications, as in there is no fashion publication that publishes once a month, 12 issues. So, what the hell happened? Before we get into the fall, let's get into the rise of the fashion magazine industry. For 400 years before the fashion magazine, Westerners would get their fashion news in the form of fashion dolls, or Pandoras. These Pandoras were essentially mini mannequins that wore meticulously constructed costumes that tailors would then copy into life-size versions for their patrons. These dolls were well-traveled, crossing oceans and enemy lines to ensure their patrons were dressed a la mode. Some even carried their own diplomatic passports. Then, in the later part of the 17th century, during Louis XIV's reign, we got fashion plates. These fashion plates were engravings used to mass print fashion illustrations that could then be hand-colored. Fashion plates were the primary medium for circulating information about fashion, particularly fashions of the French aristocracy. Fashion plates were sold to the wealthy by subscription in a series of sets called carrières and served as inspiration for dressmakers and marchands de mode, aka stylists who sold ribbons, trimmings, and other adornments that were used to upcycle old garments. Because yes, a lot of women would just alter their old dresses themselves to fit in with current trends to save money. We don't get dedicated fashion publications until the 1800s. But there are a few early fashion writings that have been discovered. For example, there were some short-lived fashion reviews in Le Courrier Français in 1649 and Le Muse Historique in 1658, though most attribute the first fashion publication to the French newspaper, the Mercure Galant. So, the Mercure Galant first launched in 1672 and did not report solely on fashion. It mostly covered literary and social events. But in 1678, the newspaper's founder, Jean Denis Devise, published a special fashion issue. Fashion coverage continued to be a mainstay of the newspaper until its death in 1931. What's interesting about the fashion coverage in this newspaper is that Denis Devise actually focused more on town wear as opposed to court dress, which was like what fashion plates were centered on. He often described the accessories, ribbons, jewels, furs, shoes, coats, sleeves, fabrics, colors, caps, hairstyles, and wigs, popular among well-born men and women. He also introduced the idea of the fashion season. Though I would argue that his most important contribution to whatever he was doing was that he actually directed all these fashion articles to women, a demographic that was not yet really being targeted. For example, in 1672, he wrote, "I had promised you, madame, to inform you of all the new styles." But, as I said, it wasn't until the 1800s when the fashion magazine industry took off. And part of the reason was the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution created both the technological and labor conditions that made mass production and distribution of magazines possible. The job markets grew, so more people could afford magazines and new clothes, which were being produced ready-made by sewing machines in unsafe garment factories run by women, immigrants, and children, unfortunately. In saying that, the exploitation of these not-so-fortunate people ensured that magazines could be produced cheaply. Women at the time also sought out magazines as a form of escapism from their duties of being a housewife. And they were also just bored, lounging around all day. Particularly if they were women of high class and they would already have maids and everyone else to run the household for them. Unlike sports, which was men's business, fashion was closely related to sewing and embroidery and therefore was an acceptable and socially promoted interest for women. Magazines were also good transportation companions. Railway travel became cheaper, and so there was a greater demand for physically manageable, short-term, and disposable reading material. Actually, just design for magazines as a whole at this point was developed to make reading on a train easier. As David Kunzel, historian of the comic strip, writes, multiple images on a page, all scanned in a moment. This is the logic of railway reading, which allowed for variety, distraction, and interruption, for superficial and momentary attention, for looking in a shaking carriage rather than sustained reading. So, similar to how modern day magazines functioned pre-internet, these 19th century magazines were there to inform women, specifically women who lived in suburban or rural areas, what was happening in the culture, what was happening in fashion, what was happening in the news. They were bringing art, culture, literature, and community to women across the nation. In sum, as Christopher Bruet writes in his article, Femininity and Consumption, better printing equipment, a falling newspaper tax, and rising literacy rates brought magazines to more households. The 1870s and 1880s brought a new variety to the genre, graphics heavy with the focus on women's position in the public world. But despite all these positive developments, there were still a number of downsides. I don't want to over-glamorize or over-romanticize the magazine industry of the 19th century. On top of the exploitation that we talked about already, men were still at the top of this industry. A lot of women who were involved were ghostwriters and often not credited for their contributions. Also, the central idea being pushed by 19th century fashion magazines was to create a feminized consumer culture. So what I mean by that is by the mid-1870s, women were expected to communicate their family's social positions through their clothing and appearance. What are you doing? See, this is why my curtains are uneven. No. No. Okay. Many fashion magazines were running stories that glamorized showy clothes and producing illustrations of beautifully dressed women in public spaces, particularly at the department store. The department store, by the way, was not only this shopping oasis for women, it was also a place of socialization, of entertainment, a place where women could just hang out with their friends, unattended and unescorted by male companions. Cameron Walker writes for the N.C. Wilson College of Textiles, these large, clean, female-staffed emporiums changed society. As shopping became an acceptable hobby, establishments like theaters and restaurants began catering to women too. The taboos against working outside the home began to crumble, and as women inched toward economic freedom, advertisements increasingly targeted them, making magazines prime advertising real estate. What did they exactly write about in fashion magazines of this era? Well, like any kind of product that's on the market, magazines tailored the content they were pushing for the women who were reading the content. So, for example, in expensive magazines, writers reported on the latest, often Parisian styles. But in lower-priced magazines, writers reported on established trends and DIY instructions. In 1852, Isabella and Samuel Beeton founded a domestic magazine for middle-class women called the Englishwoman's Domestic Magazine. The way the publication approached fashion was through featuring sewing patterns, which were basically instructions on how to make your own clothes. Compare that to Godey's Lady's Book, an expensive fashion magazine, which did sell patterns later on in its run, but was known for featuring fashion plates of the hottest styles in every monthly edition. Something interesting that was happening in the early 20th century was that custom dressmaking was actually on the decline, because now designer labels were a status symbol. For example, Charles Worth was highly coveted. Plus, in America, if you were an American woman and you were wearing Paris Couture, that was the ultimate flex, because not only could you afford this extremely expensive bespoke gown, you could afford to go to Paris.
Are you wearing the
Chanel boots? Yeah, I am.
Coco Chanel did not have a store in New York yet. You had to physically go to Paris to get measured for a custom garment made by a designer, stay there for God knows how long, probably like a week, while this dress is being made, and then you can go home. Another development, by the 20th century, women were starting to get recognition as writers and contributors to magazines. And I don't want to make like a sweeping statement and say that there were no women involved in magazines and no woman was getting credit, because obviously that's not true. Sarah Hale, Godey's Lady's Book, is an example of a woman who was clearly a woman running a magazine. It was rare. The magazine industry was still heavily dominated by men, and it still was at this point in time. It was just starting to change. One of the prominent female journalists that rose up during this time period was Virginia Pope. She worked at the New York Times from 1925 to 1955 and introduced the news industry to fashion by reporting on Paris haute couture in 1934. Moving ahead to the 1940s, the American social climate post-World War II was one of increasing affluence, social conformity, and increased leisure time. And so it's no surprise that fashion magazines aided these social changes. They provided not only a way of communicating one's status, taste, and worldliness, but also of gauging and understanding women's fluctuating interests and roles in society. Fashion magazines like Vogue continued to emphasize European, especially Parisian, fashion to audiences who were becoming more likely buyers, amassing greater wealth and seeking social capital. Teenagers were also growing in independence and getting a little bit of their own disposable income to spend on products and magazines. 17 magazine was founded in 1944. It's no longer with us in print, but iconic all the same. The publication was the first American magazine created specifically for adolescents, with its original mission to encourage teenage girls to become well-rounded human beings. And as I mentioned earlier, fashion magazines were starting to actually work with women in a decent and fair way in the early 20th century, and that only escalated in the mid-20th century. For example, Helen Gurley Brown was famed EIC of Cosmo in the 1960s, the same time that Joan Didion worked for Vogue. Susan Orlean and Gloria Steinem wrote for Glamour, and Betty Friedan's work was published in Good Housekeeping. Even for teen magazines, 17 paid to print short stories by Sylvia Plath and Ann Tyler. Another notable development in the 1950s and 60s was the decline of mass market, large general interest magazines and the rise of special interest magazines. So some mass market publications include Life, as I mentioned, Collier's, Ladies' Home Journal, and Reader's Digest. Special interest magazines that rose up in the mid-century include Avant-Garde, New Scientist, and Sports Illustrated. So what was the reason for this shift? Well, for one, there were a number of factors, economic factors, that came into play. In the 1960s, mass market publication was competing with television. As journalism professor David Abrahamson writes, during the 1960s, TV's share of the national advertising expenditures more than doubled, which directly reduced both the price of magazine ads and advertisers' interest in buying space in magazines. Computers were also becoming a thing in the 1960s. So I don't know if you've watched Mad Men. I feel like I'm always plugging Mad Men, but it's literally like, I think, my favorite TV show of all time. If you watched Mad Men, you'll remember that there's a scene where they bring in a computer for the office and it's massive and everyone's freaking out about it. And one of the characters actually goes crazy and never returns. I later read that the reason he disappeared was because he got a better job. Like, he got like a main character role somewhere on another TV show, so he had to leave Mad Men, and that was just the storyline they ran with. Him losing his mind slowly because he was getting paranoid that technology was going to replace humans.
Get out while you can!
But computer technology in the 1960s led to the evolution of proprietary research in market segmentation by lifestyle, attitudes, and behaviors. Ad agencies started to really specify on the demographics that they wanted to advertise to. So for instance, rather than inventing a product and then finding customers for it, agencies were now first studying the customers and then making what the customers wanted. And what ad agencies were finding out is that it was actually much more profitable for a camera company like Nikon to advertise their cameras in specialized photography magazines like US Camera than to advertise in just a general interest magazine like The New Yorker. Also at the same time, major advantages in printing technology greatly reduced the cost of producing a magazine. Specifically, the computerization of typesetting and color separation processes created reduced per copy manufacturing costs. In other words, in the early 20th century, publishers were printing large print runs to be cost effective, basic economies of scale. But now, because costs were not so high to produce a magazine, it was actually more cost effective to produce small circulation magazines. So let's fast forward to the 1980s and 90s, which is arguably the peak of fashion magazines' relevance and clout. Editors of major publications were dubbed as tastemakers and treated like celebrities. They had the power to make or break the careers of up-and-coming designers and models. And yes, this was the era of the supermodel as well. Watch my video on the supermodel for more on that. But just in general, cover shots became all the more prestigious. 2000s chick flick movies, The Devil Wears Prada, 13 Going on 30, and How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, showcase the status and reputation of the 90s era fashion magazine industry as a highly coveted place to work at, and with the editor as the highest step of the ladder. In the words of former deputy editor of Vanity Fair, Dana Brown, it was the age of the glossy magazine and the celebrity editor. They were the arbiters of taste, translators of culture and style to the culture and style hungry masses. They decided what was cool, what was important, what was necessary, what made it onto their pages, what people would be talking about, watching, reading, wearing, thinking. He also told the New York Times, there were so many magazines in 1994, so many new magazines, and so many great magazines. All the young talent of the moment was eschewing other industries and flocking to the business. It was the coolest place to be. But of course, these industries were never as glamorous as they seemed. Even in The Devil Wears Prada, the main character, Andy, who works as the assistant to this fashion editor-in-chief, Miranda Priestley, she ends up leaving the industry at the end of the movie because she kind of like sobers up to the reality of how damaging the industry is to her own mental health. And also, just like as a side note, I know that there's always like this discussion about how the real villain of The Devil Wears Prada was her boyfriend, who was unsupportive of her joining this fashion magazine. I think he's annoying. I don't think she should have stayed with him. But I do think that's like an oversimplification of the story because Andy didn't want to work in a fashion magazine. She didn't want to do it. Like, that wasn't something she was dreaming of. She wanted to work at a normal, like, paper covering news. So I feel like her leaving the fashion business and going to do that is a good thing because that's what she wanted to do from the beginning. You know what I mean? Anyways, Francesca Mari actually wrote a really good article on the assistant economy back in 2015 for Dissent magazine. And in this article, she discusses what the job actually entails, like what being an assistant is actually like. And she talks about how in a lot of these movies and novels and memoirs that are written from like the POV of an assistant, this type of media glamorize the realities of what the job actually is. And she says something really crazy here, like I have to read this quote. She writes, "This mythologizing is relentless and trifling, but it fills a real need. The need to justify your job by making your boss as big and as marvelous as possible. And that, after all, is what the boss always wanted." So why are print fashion magazines dying? Well, we can definitely blame the internet because before the internet, magazines had exclusive insights about what trends were going to come up, exclusive commentary about runway shows, and exclusive coverage of celebrities and public figures at fashion events. Now with the internet, anyone with a big or small brain can say anything they want about anything related to fashion. They can predict what fashion trends exist. And even celebrities themselves can post whatever photos of them at an event. They can put their own commentary. They can say whatever they want about a fashion show to an audience directly from their Instagram accounts or their TikTok accounts or their podcasts. And the thing with runway shows, they used to be held twice a year for a closed shop of editors and buyers who would reveal their carefully considered vision of trends to readers and customers a few months down the line. Now, runway shows are live streamed and photographs of shows are immediately disseminated. And so consumers know exactly what clothes will be hitting shelves. Runway shows have also become, in my opinion, less like industry related events, especially with the number of celebrities and influencers that are sitting front row in attendance. And yes, I realize I have benefited from that. I am guilty of that. And I'm thankful for that at the same time. But, you know, at least I pay attention. I've been to a couple shows where people don't pay attention. And actually, specifically, this one show I will remember very well because I was sitting next to this woman who was an influencer from Europe. And she had brought along her assistant to the show. And the entire time, she was posting photo on Instagram. She was like writing a caption because these fashion shows, they only last like a couple minutes. You know, it doesn't take that long for the girls to be revolving around. And this particular show didn't have that many looks. So it went by really fast. Anyways, she was just like typing on her little phone while her assistant was recording the entire show. She did not look up once from her phone. At that point, I'm like, why are you even going? Other than, I guess, to like flex that you've gone to your audience. But if you're not enjoying your time, if you're not actually paying attention to the collections, then what's the point? Like, there are tons of other people who would love to be sitting there. But my point is that the presence of influencers and celebrities shows the shift from fashion shows being just about new collections for the next season and more about the spectacle. It's marketing for the brand as a whole. A lot of buyers don't even go to actual fashion shows anymore. They go to buying appointments. And with influencers and even publications recording and posting photos of the show, there's less mystique. And so anyone who comes across these videos or comes across these photos can have an opinion and say their opinion online. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I think democratization of fashion is actually a really positive thing. But it does explain why there's less prestige in fashion journalism among the general public. Founder and EIC of the Business of Fashion, Imran Ahmed, says, "The one thing that has changed dramatically in recent years is the direct relationship brands now have with their consumers. In this new hierarchy, the consumer has the ability to amplify or negatively impact business through sharing positive or negative responses. Once, brands and magazines dictated what we should buy. Now, consumers are telling us what they like and want. And the power structure has been turned on its head." I also think that another reason, maybe perhaps more controversial reason, that there's a decline in magazines is because a lot of the content being published today is just not revolutionary. or it's just bad. It's not even good sometimes. Magazines often rely on publishing the same kind of content that they've been publishing for years now. Dieting tips, heteronormative dating advice, recycled makeup tips that we've seen over and over again. Like, this is all just very boring content, and it just hasn't aged well. Yet magazines are often too risk adverse to change it up.
I've been working on something that's kind of different. It's a political piece.
No.
And it's...
Andy, you work at Composure magazine. We are fashion, trends, diets, cosmetic surgery, salacious gossip. That's Composure.
Okay, but...
Look, Andy, okay.
Professor Harriet Brown says the magazine's insistence on the status quo, even as womanhood changed dramatically, led them to irrelevance. In an era of radical body acceptance and upteenth wave feminism, I don't want to read 2,500 articles a year on how to lose 10 pounds or get rid of my love handles. It's reductive and it's superficial. Also, this desire to be like the first publication to cover a specific topic has led to a lot of journalists like lazily relying on unchecked sources, which has led to overall a decline in accuracy and quality within magazine articles. In a lot of these magazines' heydays, part of the reason why they were so respected was because they covered groundbreaking material. For example, in 1966, Glamour was the first fashion magazine to feature a black woman, Katiti Karonde, as the cover model, a gesture towards inclusion amid the civil rights movement. And in 1976, dozens of editors of women's and teen magazines agreed to cover the Equal Rights Amendment, with stories that would reach their collective 60 million readers. I think it's also important to note that for these articles, there were lots of fact checkers on board. Journalist Andrea Bartz says the old magazines had a team of people whose job was to verify every detail in the magazine. Everything those magazines were telling me about at the time, nutrition or sexual assault statistics or mental health, it was coming from legitimate sources and it was verified by the staff there. While I think there is this kind of gradual push for fashion magazines to cover groundbreaking cultural news, like for instance, InStyle was publishing a lot about the anti-Asian hate crimes, Cosmopolitan was covering Roe v. Wade. There is an issue with fact checking because every magazine wants to be the first to cover something because they want the most eyes on their article. And so there's like this rush that wasn't necessarily there for print magazine because you had to still wait like until the next morning to be able to print something, or you would have to wait to the end of the week or the end of the month because it just depends how many issues your magazine would publish a year. And I think the expediency that's required to publish content now has also led to a lot of like outsourcing facts from social media and not like looking deeper into those facts and to see whether or not they're like actually facts. And ultimately, magazines make their money through advertising. Regardless of the medium, advertising is the profit driver. And advertisers don't want to advertise unless there are a certain number of people buying the issues, guaranteed, every time they come up. Or if you're publishing online, there has to be a high click engagement. This ends up driving editors to publish content only about established subjects, models, and designers and away from creativity and up-and-comers. Hence why the Kardashians are just like ever present. But let's talk more about advertising. So the thing with internet advertising is that it is much easier to track than print advertising. Companies that purchase web advertisements can see exactly how many people are clicking through. They can measure the impact of their ad, and therefore calculate how much money they are making back from publishing this ad. This advancement both exploits audience data and also makes digital advertising way more lucrative and way more worthy of investing in than print advertising. And with internet publishing becoming more lucrative and more omnipresent, a lot of publications have resorted to coming up with more creative ideas to get people to click on links, which has actually led a lot of people to distrust these publications. One example that raised a lot of eyebrows was Refinery 29's Money Diary series. This was a series where they would profile the spending habits of a different anonymous person every few days. Joe Livingstone wrote a pretty scathing critique of it and actually the entire website on the New Republic back in 2018. They wrote, Refinery 29's My Identity section, for example, featured an article titled, How Fashion Helps These Three People Express Pride. It's an ad for H&M, dressed up as an article about queer and trans people finding their voice through clothing. There's also the old secret style language of the LGBTQ plus community, a mere click away from an advertisement by Free People on what to wear to an outdoor summer concert. The article was inspired by internet pushback towards one Money Diaries entry from July 2018 with the headline, A Week in New York City on $25 an hour, which was later changed to A Week in New York City on $25 an hour and $1,000 monthly allowance. The original headline was misleading because it's revealed that the profile girl's parents paid her $2,100 monthly rent, her tuition, phone bill, health insurance bills, and gave her an extra $1,100 in allowance every month. The virality of this piece opened up a whole can of worms with people criticizing the series as a whole, with some even theorizing that the Money Diaries was fake to begin with and was just a clever way to feature sponsored brands. Regardless of whether that's true or not, Livingstone condemns the way women's publications have gone about advertising. They write, the difference between today's women's media scam and yesterday's is that the advertising is now hiding in native content, and the scummy clickbait is packaged better. Instead of sitting in a box next to a trashy article about celebrities, lucrative advertising these days lurks inside content that simulates ethical feminist journalism. Unfortunately, I think while we like to criticize editors and even writers for this kind of content shift, they have to do what they can to survive. It's sort of the same deal with YouTube. Like, I feel like there's so many topics I would love to discuss, but I have to create this like balancing act where I have content that I think is really like wide reaching, a trending topic that's going to get me guaranteed views and therefore guaranteed money to pay all my bills and everything, and then balancing it with esoteric niche content that I actually do really want to talk about, but I know is not going to get me the same number of clicks. So I love print magazines. I love their fun layouts. I love the graphic designs. I love like the glossy photographs. I just love magazines. There's just like a certain pizzazz, a certain, dare I say, romance that online magazines don't have. I think Shante Cosme, editor-in-chief of Mike Magazine, puts it perfectly. Print has a languorous feeling to it, and I think that's a good thing. Magazines should encourage slow, thoughtful reading and aim to be more literary than informative. They should be brimming with stimulating images and ideas that invite reflection and encourage close reading. Magazines should interrogate and provoke, inspire us to shake off the dullness of the everyday. They should get us feeling strange emotions and thinking existential thoughts in a cafe at noon on a Saturday. I think the major struggle that magazines are dealing with is the fact that information travels so fast now and trends come and go so quickly. What was relevant last week may not be relevant again this week. So to create a print magazine these days, you have to be really careful. You have to really consider what is going to have relevance by the time this magazine comes out on shelves, which, you know, it sometimes takes weeks. It sometimes takes months to create a print magazine. But I think also, like, because of this challenge, it allows print magazines to come up with something really, truly special. Something that does have that kind of cultural longevity. Something that people will leaf through and revisit for months after the initial publication. As Anna Wintour says, well, I think that it's very important to make the print publications even more luxurious and even more special just to differentiate us from everything else that's out there. Print publications have to be as luxurious an experience as possible. You have to feel it coming off the page. You have to see photographs and pieces that you couldn't possibly see anywhere else. Okay, so this is the end of the video. Thank you all so much for watching, and if you want to listen to an extended version, I will be releasing a podcast episode that is basically this, but with more information, and then also I'm going to be interviewing one of my close friends who works in the magazine industry. So tune in for that. It's highbrow on any platform. And yeah, for now, you can just let me know in the comments what you think about print magazines, fashion magazines, whether you too wanted to be just like Andy and the Devil Wears Prada, except actually end up as Miranda Priestley.
Everybody wants to be us.
Yeah, let me know. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you next time. Bye!